That's exactly the difference between artificial eyelashes and realistic ones. Once the lashes are complete, use the mono zero eraser and electric eraser to carefully lift the highlights inside the eye. It's amazing how a highlight only a few millimeters wide can completely change the expression of the portrait. That tiny sparkle is often the moment when the drawing stops looking like graphite on paper and finally begins looking back at you. But the eye is only the beginning, because the next few features are where this portrait truly starts showing its age. A few simple techniques around the eyebrows, nose and cheeks will completely transform the softness of the face. And that's exactly what we'll build next. If you want to watch the full step-by-step tutorial of this drawing, you can access it on our Academy site. Link is in the description. Now that the eye has started looking alive, it's time to work on something that many artists don't pay enough attention to, which is the eyebrows. You'd be surprised how much influence these tiny hairs have on the age and expression of a portrait. One of the biggest mistakes beginners make is drawing baby eyebrows exactly the same way they draw adult eyebrows. The proportions may be correct, but the portrait immediately starts looking older because the eyebrows become too dark, too dense and too well defined. To avoid that, use a sharp 3B pencil and begin building the eyebrow with soft, thin strokes instead of bold lines. The reason for choosing a 3B pencil here is simple. It gives much better control over the darkness, allowing you to create delicate hairs simply by changing your pressure instead of constantly switching pencils. Another thing worth paying attention to is the direction of growth. Near the inner corner, the hairs naturally point upward, but as they move towards the middle, they slowly begin curving sideways before gently fading away at the tail. Rather than thinking about individual hairs, try thinking about the overall flow of the eyebrow, because that's what our eyes recognize first. One simple trick that helps tremendously is keeping your pencil extremely sharp throughout this stage. Baby eyebrows are incredibly fine, and even the most carefully placed stroke can start looking heavy if the pencil loses its point. As the eyebrow reaches its tail, gradually reduce both the number of hairs and their darkness. Adult eyebrows often have a clearly defined ending, but baby eyebrows usually fade so softly that they almost disappear into the surrounding skin. Once the hairs are established, introduce a few tiny highlights with the electric eraser to break up the surface. Those subtle value changes help the eyebrow blend naturally into the skin, instead of sitting on top of it. Now let's move on to the nose, and the good news is that you already know most of the technique because we learned it while working on the forehead. From this point onwards, the real challenge isn't learning a new method, it's learning how to read the light. Every facial feature follows the same principles, but the highlights and texture change depending on how the light is wrapping around that particular form. Start by cleaning the edge of the nose using your mono zero eraser. Then use a 3B pencil if any part of the outline needs a slight adjustment. Once the proportions look right, grab your 8B pencil and darken the dull areas. Remember to use variable pressure here because the shadow shouldn't stop suddenly. It should gradually fade as the surface turns towards the light. Now, just like we did on the forehead, build the main highlight using your mono zero eraser. But this time, let the highlight follow the long curve of the nose instead of creating a circular shape. Notice how the highlight becomes brightest along the raised bridge and then slowly softens as the surface curves away. That gradual transition is what makes the nose feel rounded instead of flat. Once the main highlight is in place, lightly soften it using a clean blending stump. Then begin introducing the texture. Rather than covering the entire nose with dots, look for the areas where the light is strongest, because that's exactly where the brightest texture belongs. Use your electric eraser to create those clusters of dots. Then soften the surrounding edges with the mono zero eraser so the texture naturally blends into the skin. As you move towards the tip of the nose, you'll notice the light becomes much stronger. Instead of immediately adding bright dots, first create a soft base highlight, and then place the brighter texture only on the highest point. This simple layering technique creates a much more natural shine than placing bright highlights directly onto dark graphite. Now moving on to the mouth, the technique remains exactly the same, but this time pay close attention to how the light is describing each curve of the lips. Start by identifying the darkest areas because they establish the overall structure. Then gradually shift your attention towards the highlights that define the shape. Notice how the Cupid's bow catches a crisp highlight, making the upper lip appear fuller, while the tiny broken highlights around the mouth create those subtle changes in plane that make the lips feel soft and rounded. Instead of treating every highlight equally, keep asking yourself which ones are actually shaping the form and which ones are simply adding texture. Once you begin observing the lips this way, you'll find it much easier to recreate their natural volume and softness. The chin follows exactly the same principle. Instead of thinking about texture first, look at the overall form and identify the highest point that's facing the light. That's where your brightest highlight should naturally appear. As the surface begins turning away from the light, allow the highlights to become softer and less noticeable. Another detail worth observing is the separation between the cheek and the chin. Even a subtle change in brightness along this edge clearly explains where one form ends and the next begins, giving the lower part of the face much more depth without adding unnecessary detail. Now let's move on to the cheek. Just like the previous features, the technique remains the same, but this time the goal is creating the largest and softest highlight on the face. Before adding any texture, first identify the highest point of the cheek, because that's where the light is falling most directly. Using your electric eraser, build the brightest cluster of dots around that highest point. Then switch to your mono zero eraser to create the softer surrounding texture, just like we did on the forehead. The secret here isn't adding more texture, it's gradually reducing both the brightness and the density of the highlights as they move away from the light. That's what creates the beautiful roundness of the cheek. Once you're happy with the texture, gently soften it using a kneaded eraser. Finally, add just a handful of the brightest accents using a jelly roll pen on the highest points of the cheek. Think of these as the final sparkle. A few carefully placed highlights will make the skin look fresh and realistic, while too many will flatten the form instead of enhancing it.